I'm going to skip very quickly through some of the environmental issues that I've been personally involved in and that I've done work on. And that will give you some idea of where I'm coming from, how I think. And then there are a number of issues here, particularly pylons and health concerns, which I won't touch on, though I have been actively involved in, because I leave those for the question and answer session. Also fracking and the emissions targets. I will mention that briefly. So I'm deliberately not dealing with those now, because we will come to them in a few minutes. So other than that, I'd like to just give you some idea of, as I said, some of the issues I've been involved in. First of all, I'm a substitute member on the Agriculture Committee. So therefore, I was very much involved in the CAP negotiations, etc. And one of the red lines for the Parliament was that 25% of Pillar 2 would go to agri-environment schemes. And that eventually was agreed by the Council. And also, of course, that there would be no double payment, because, again, as you are aware, for the first time ever, 30% of the single farm payment is now linked to the provision of public goods, or greening as they call it. That is a radical departure for the EU, and fully supported by the Parliament, and indeed by farming interests in Ireland. There was some concerns about it initially, but largely not. They're minor at this point. But again, it indicates the overall thrust or the general direction of where that policy is going. Also, I would have had quite a bit of contact with organic farmers around the country. We were expecting the Commission communication on organic farming last September, but it didn't arrive until about a month ago. There's some very positive things in that for any of you here who are interested in organic farming. And I look forward, hopefully, if I'm re-elected, to working with interests in Ireland on amending and changing that legislation. Because a lot of people sometimes wonder, what do we do in Europe? Well, like most jobs, it's under the radar and it's not headline stuff. What I do most of the time is I amend proposals from the Commission. And how I amend them will depend on my own perspective on it, or what the issue is. So if it's something to do with organic farming, what do? I will talk to various bodies representing organic farmers in Ireland, and I will work with them in looking at the specific legislation as drafted and take suggestions from them as to what amendments might be put forward. But that's only part of it, because anybody can put down an amendment, and some people put down amendments that they don't even write themselves, but that's neither here nor there. But then you've got to get support for your amendment. You know, you've got to get people to agree with your perspective. And that really is a lot of what our work is about. It's working with people to try to get agreement on these issues. Other areas where I've been involved is the whole area of bees. Many of you here may know who Philip McCabe is. I got to know Philip quite a number of years ago. He's the chairman of Apamundia, and you often hear him on Mooney Goes Wild. And I got to know Philip many years ago. I know nothing about bees, but he knows everything about bees. So therefore, and we've had a number of reports and a legislative document on bees. And again, I work with Philip because he's the expert. So that's how I work on issues like that. And I was the only Irish MEP to sign a letter to the European Commission asking them to ban neonicotinoids from the point of view, I mean, one of the issues you're concerned about is biodiversity. And thankfully, the European Commission responded positively to that, and there is a temporary ban for 2 years at least, despite the fact that a number of large member states were opposed to it. But if you're to never mind the precautionary principle, there's plenty of evidence there that neonics can damage the bee population. So again, that was, you know, again, an area where I am actively involved. The Environmental Impact Assessment Directive has finally finished its way through the Parliament. I was one of those who lobbied heavily, and indeed the author of that particular piece of legislation is Zanoni, who's a member of the group I'm in the Parliament, and for example, a mandatory environmental impact assessment on fracking. We got that through the Parliament, just about, but unfortunately it was dropped in the final negotiation because Council wouldn't have it. And it then and this is another example of how things are rarely black and white, which you know anyway. We had to decide in the Parliament then, would we vote for this piece of legislation, which improved things a bit in some areas, but didn't have the mandatory EIA for fracking. I voted against it as it happened. I think it's scandalous that we have a mandatory EIA. We don't have a mandatory EIA for fracking, and we do for fencing of more than, or hedgerows of more than 500 metres, whatever. There's no comparison between the two things. Look, as far as emissions are concerned, again, we had a very split vote in the Parliament, but I'm one of those who voted for the Commission's proposal of 40%. I want to mention TTIP because a lot of people are concerned about that and about the investor-state dispute mechanism and how that would impact large multinationals taking member states to court, etc. I've written to the Commission, I've got a response on it, and if anybody wants to ask me questions about that, but it's something I'm actively watching because, we've got the bigger scheme of things and we've got the smaller. Biofuels, indirect land use change. Again, I supported the Environment Committee stance on that. We ended up with a compromise which is not as good as the Environment Committee, but a lot better than the Industry Committee. And finally,
we have a question on GMOs coming up. It wasn't on the ones we sent you.
All right, so I won't say anything on it. Okay, thank you. Well, I spoke briefly earlier about the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, and certainly we've strengthened that somewhat. We have dealt with issues like conflict of interest in it, for example. We dealt somewhat with cross-border issues in regard to fracking and I suppose indeed exploration for any other kind of fossil fuel, etc. We did not extend the mandatory EIA to fracking, though we did to some other types of processes, etc. So, I feel that it was an improvement on what's there, and I suppose sometimes that's what we do. We take incremental steps at European level. In regard to the Commission's proposals, as I said, I supported a 40% CO2 reduction in CO2 emissions, but I do think we need to place more emphasis on energy efficiency. I think for me that's a win-win. It's a win-win with consumers, with individuals, and it also means we need to import less fossil fuels, because if we were to look at something like a deep retrofit of homes, of buildings, etc., that would considerably save the amount of energy we use in the first place. And as I said, it would lower bills for people, but also it would have the effect of reducing CO2 emissions. And I think sometimes we need to be careful at European level that it's easy at one level for us in the Parliament to set targets for other people to meet. So we therefore have to be pragmatic and practical about it and try to find ways of allowing that to happen. There has been a huge debate in Ireland about renewable energy. Well, not about renewable energy, just about industrial wind turbines. And it's unfortunate that is how people now view renewable energy. If we look at Denmark, 60% of all wind energy are they're community owned. If we look at Germany, we have wind farmers. They don't farm anything else, they farm wind. So instead of engaging the community and making it acceptable to the community, what we've done, unfortunately so far at least, is we have allowed developers to lead this. And because of the possibility of high subsidies, etc., which of course is also changing at European level, has changed. So those are some of the areas that I would focus on, but I would also strongly focus on legislation to protect biodiversity. I think that's a huge challenge, as well as the climate change issue. I suppose I don't really
need... We have a question on that anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Thanks,
okay, all right. So the question is, would I support an emissions target of 55%? And the answer to that is no. And I'll tell you why. It's not that I don't think it isn't a good idea, but I sort of half answered this question earlier. It would be very easy for me in the Parliament to press the green button and say, yes, 55% sounds like a good idea. Probably is a good idea. But, and again, I want to be very straight with you. When I say no, that's qualified no in this sense. What we need to look at is how we can get to that point. So I think the Parliament has a responsibility as well, not just in voting for targets, but in trying to ensure that European policy is such, and to work with the Commission and guide the Commission on it to make sure that we can reach the highest possible target. As I said, pressing the green button is the easiest thing to do in the world, and you sound good and it's all fine. I am not sure we can reach 55% by 2030. I know certainly the European Council wouldn't wear it or have it at all. So one of the things we have to try and do at European level is to get agreement. And in my view, you are better trying to get agreement on something that is achievable. Certainly you aim as high as you can. I'm not sure that 55% by 2030, as we are now, is achievable. It's not that it isn't an objective. But would I vote to say we should have binding targets of 55% CO2 reduction emissions by 2030 on member states right now? And the answer to that is no. That doesn't mean I wouldn't do it in 2 or 3 years' time if we can put in place policies that would help to achieve that. I have supported the 40%, and you may be interested in knowing it was a very split Parliament supported that. Half of them said yes and half of them said no. So you have half of the Parliament not even saying yes to 40%. And by the looks of it, if a lot of the, what we might call the more Eurosceptic right-wing parties are elected to the Parliament, and I believe many of them will be, there will be a lot more people saying no. So that's my view on that. I've already outlined the work I've done on bees and neonicotinoids, etc., and I will continue in that vein as far as protecting that particular part of our biodiversity is concerned. Also, I think the whole issue of pesticides needs to be addressed, and again, we need to look at the precautionary principle. It's a wider perspective, if you like, on the neonics, or just a particular type of pesticide that's used. But we need to look at the broader aspect there. But I think a point that has been raised by the former two speakers, and it is very important, and that is you need to work with people. And one of the things that can sometimes happen is that people have the view that things are imposed. Now, I disagree with Ming on some of what he says. I mean, European legislation isn't imposed. It is agreed by the Parliament, by the Council. We elect our minister to go there, and that then it is transposed into Irish legislation, and it is voted through Dáil Éireann. Now, the problem is 95% of the time it's voted through by statutory instrument. Most people don't even know it's going through. The issue, I think, on the Habitats Directive and the bogs that Ming mentioned, and bogs are hugely important when it comes to protecting our biodiversity, is that at some point somebody sat down in an office and drew lines on maps. And sometimes as late, and I remember this because I was back in the late 90s and the early 2000s as chairperson of the Council for the West. I went to meetings all over the west of Ireland on this issue. So this is, as you know, it's not something recent. And people found out sometimes as late as 5 years later that their lands were designated, and they never knew anything about it. And the whole process that we used was so flawed from the start that it got people's backs up. And now it's a real difficulty trying to unwind some of that mess. And the issue is that you've got to try and bring people with you. But I mentioned about pesticides, and you know, in that context, we need to have the precautionary principle as far as I'm concerned. I mentioned about the 30% greening payment and the single farm payment, and of course ecological focus areas are very important for biodiversity, and again that is part of that proposal. And again, there are challenges there, particularly for grain farmers, etc. But I think they can be managed. One of the problems we were facing with this, and it just shows the difficulties of this, is the Commission were coming forward with delegated acts on this. And they were talking about the circumference of the trees and the diameter of the trees and how this could be used, in the ecological focus areas. That drives farmers daft. It would drive me daft. I'm sure it would drive most of you daft as well. So it's how to measure these things, make them doable so that people aren't screaming about it before it starts. So that's a real challenge with all of this. And that's again how you've got to get people to work with you. Making legislation is not the most difficult thing in the world, but implementing it properly and bringing people with you is a much more difficult process. I think the Commission buckled it on the ETS recently. One of the difficulties about trade agreements is there's the carrot and the stick. I mean, we come up against this all the time when we do trade agreements with countries over fishing, when we do trade agreements with Colombia, for example. It's a country I've got to know a little bit about because I've tried to find out what's going on there about human rights and about the rights of workers and trade unions. And how do you bind all of that in with a trade agreement? How much can the European Union do in the context of the carrot and the stick? And my answer to that would be, I would go as far as possible to try to if you like, by the promise of more trade, to bring the Chinese into the process. Because of course, I think we all know that if it isn't a global process, it doesn't work. So that's, I suppose, the answer to that. And this is an issue on which I think I can justly say I have led, mainly because of my work with the Seinher Committee and the various reports that they have issued. We had a draft report in 2013 and about the fact that ELF is that the link between ELF and childhood leukemia is still valid. That's what that report says. I was angry beyond words that the morning that that report was published, one of our national newspapers led with a story, which it hadn't seen the report. I knew what was in it. I knew there was no change. That's what they had told me. But it led with the story that basically said no change was no risk. And that gained a lot of traction over the next few days. The report states what the previous report said. But rather than just talk about reports, I am working with Professor Dennis Henshaw, and he is working with a number of other scientists who are experts in this area. And I took a day out of a very busy canvassing schedule to go to Athens, where there was a 2-day conference. It was part of the public consultation on Seinher, and I addressed that conference. And I myself have made 2 submissions to the Seinher report, advocating a number of issues. Number one, that they take all the relevant reports into consideration, and number two, that they, if you were to read through the detail of the report, it becomes very clear that when they investigate a report that says there is a link, they investigate it very thoroughly, as they should. When they investigate a report that says there isn't a link, they don't. They accept that as valid. So that's not an equal way of dealing with it. And all I want is that we have the best possible scientific evidence to give us the best possible information, so that then when we come to make decisions, if there is risk, and I believe there is, and I believe very strongly there is because of my connections, particularly with Professor Henshaw, who is one of the world's foremost experts in this area, through meeting him personally, through emailing and speaking with him on a regular basis, that we then mitigate that risk. And how we go about it is something that we can decide. But to pretend, as we hear again and again from EirGrid and others, that there is no risk, then that is simply not true. And if we even look to other European countries, we see that even in those countries where they don't underground, and many countries are moving towards at least partial undergrounding, we see that they take precautions. They don't rely on the ICNIRP recommendations of distance from these power lines. Many countries take precautions that are 10 times better than the basic guidelines. Anyway, those guidelines need to be revised. So again, it's not just, I don't just talk about it, I try to actively get involved in it and change what is happening. Whether I will succeed or not is another question. Very briefly, fracking. If elected, would I demand a strategic environmental assessment is carried out for exploratory licence? Absolutely. You know my record in the Parliament where that's concerned. So yes is the answer to that question. I believe, and I think I said this earlier, that, unfortunately our renewables policy, in inverted commas, has been driven largely by developers. When there's a vacuum, somebody or something will always rush in to fill it, and I think that's what's happened. The idea that there were subsidies at the end of the line that were there, whether the wind blew or the wind didn't blow, and that this was a money-making operation. And I think that's what has driven it up to now. It's a bit like the turf cutting in a way. We now have communities that are split. People promise money for locating these industrial type 187 metre monstrosities on their farms, promise money, and if somebody came and promised you money in the dark of night, you might consider it too. We might all consider it, because people's personal circumstances are such that very few people can say no to that kind of thing. And yet there's huge division among families, never mind among neighbours. So all of this has been happening without anybody knowing. And just one vignette, and I will stop then. Mm-hmm. A colleague of mine from the Lib Dems was at a conference here in Dublin. She's on the Environment Committee. She was at a conference in Dublin during the Irish presidency. And at that conference, they were talking about wind energy. And she asked the question of somebody there, now this is over a year ago, are there any objections to these in Ireland? And she was told, no, absolutely not. There's no problem, because she knew what was happening in the UK. And there wasn't 12 months ago, because people didn't know what was happening. So unfortunately, the whole thing now has got tied up. What I call for is we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to have a proper SEA. We need to have a proper cost-benefit analysis. Yes, we need renewables. We need proper setback distances. And we need also to bring communities with us and to have community gain where it is appropriate. But unfortunately, the debate has been hijacked. I think maybe now, because the UK have not agreed to the export of our high-priced wind energy from Ireland, because that agreement isn't going ahead, for now at least. I think that will put a stop to the gallop of some of those involved. But that's no good either, because we need to have a proper strategy and a proper policy. And unfortunately, because of what's happened, we don't have one at the moment.
Thank you, Marian. And
okay.
Give Marian a round of applause, because he's leaving us now. It's appreciation. Thanks very much, Marian.